Hey, I'm Michael, and this is Michael in the Middle. It's an intergenerational relational podcast for people who are interested in better human interaction. I'm glad you're here. Hey, folks, welcome to episode 26 of Michael in the Middle. That would be approximately a half a year if you went for 26 weeks straight. And I think we've been able to bring you an episode all but 1 week during this time since we launched in August. And I want to say thanks again to our producer, Rob Walls of Varnish Media, for helping us get this launched. And I want to say thank you to you. Been really pleasantly surprised at the engagement that this podcast has gotten from its listening and viewing audience, and I'm quite honored by that. Episode 25 with Shonda Pierce was quite the ride, and really enjoyed being with her and talking about some of the things in her life. And now as we move forward, there are going to be some great guests in subsequent episodes as well. But I wanted to expand a little bit on my own personal story, and that's what this episode's gonna talk about. I'm drinking from one of my favorite mugs here, and I can't remember if this is one of my mom's or if this is one that my wife got. Both of these amazing ladies kind of fell in love with Starbucks mugs from different places, and so the mug from which I'm drinking this morning comes from Mississippi, and so many great memories down there. One of the first people that we met as a family, one of the first families, I should say, that we met when we moved to Mississippi in 1975 was Charles and Shirley Johnson. And beginning in 1961 until his passing in January of 2022. So that's 61 years. Charles Johnson pastored the Fitkins Memorial Church of the Nazarene in Meridian, Mississippi. Charles became a legendary figure in Lauderdale County there, Meridian and surrounding areas. He was the central witness for the prosecution, the main witness for the prosecution in the Mississippi burning trial. Some of you might be familiar with that. But Charles was also a dear friend of our families. And in fact, he and my dad joked about being brothers. And it became actually quite serious for them. They loved each other deeply. My dad lost his wife, my mother, in November of 2021, and then he lost his brother Charles in January of 2022. Charles is just an amazing person, and we're staying in touch with Shirley as best we can. My brother and I, Jeffrey and I, look so fondly upon those years in Mississippi, and we had the opportunity to do a couple of different things with my dad and Charles. And a couple of years ago, we went down. Jeffrey's son-in-law, Preston Kaiser, came with him from Houston, and we went down and got some really great videotape. We've shared some of those things, not here on the blog, on the podcast, but just some great memories of Charles and Shirley Johnson. And I would say that if you've never read the amazing book that Dr. Chet Bush wrote, Called to the Fire, it's the story of Charles Johnson and how he moved about in his ministry there in Meridian, and particularly as it related to that trial. Fascinating book, fascinating person, and I'll probably find ways to pay tribute to Charles and Shirley, down the road in some future episodes. A couple of weeks ago, my wife Sarah and I were invited to come down to Oxford, Mississippi, where I filled in for Pastor Jeff Byler at the Nazarene Church there. Jeff asked me to come down because he and Nicole were celebrating the birth of their third child, and it was a great trip. Oxford is such a cool place. There's a lot of layers to the history there in Oxford, but we always enjoy going, and we had a great time with our friends Dr. Morris and Cindy Stocks, Trevecca alumni who have been a part of the Ole Miss community for 32 years now. Morris has served in a variety of roles, including faculty uh, in the School of Accountancy. He was provost of the university. For a time, he was interim chancellor, a history-making interim chancellor. We'll talk about that in another episode as well. Whenever I go to Oxford, right behind the Lyceum Administration Building, there at the campus, on the campus, is this amazing statue of James Meredith. And I had heard of James Meredith in the history books as being the first black student at Ole Miss. If you know anything about it, 1962, he found his way to Ole Miss and basically, I guess you could say, forced the issue for him to be able to become the first black student there. His admission into Ole Miss actually paved the way for students of color to be able to go to schools across the South. Legendary figure, but and I'll tell you a little later as I share this blog about how I came to even know him personally. When we moved to Mississippi in 1975, it was quite a change for us, and one of the best ways I think I can help understand if you're interested in all my own story and why I ended up kind of being in the middle of some of these things that I'm doing now. I think this blog will help kind of inform that. So bear with me. I'm gonna try to be as engaging and expressive as possible while I read to you. Having been raised in Oklahoma from the time of my birth in 1960 until the summer of 1975, I guess you could say that life for me was a pretty sweet, compact, and safe arrangement. My family, while not wealthy, had many advantages and was blessed by the warmth of a caring congregation in the two churches my father served as pastor: Elk City, Oklahoma, out on historic Route 66, and then Western Oaks Church of the Nazarene on the southwest side of town in Oklahoma City. My peer group throughout my first 15 years of life looked and acted very much like me. Our most regular foray into cultural diversity was Indian City near Anadarko, Oklahoma. When I got to junior high school, we had almost 1,500 students, 3 of which were black, and I knew all 3 of them. I thought I was good at relating with people of a different background than my own. In the summer of 1975, my father was appointed to be superintendent of our Nazarene churches in Mississippi. And I had heard of Mississippi and of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Andrew Young, and others, but I knew very little about my new home state. I had heard that people of different races had trouble getting along there, but I still thought I was good at relating with people of a different background than my own. I remember 2 things in particular about those first few months. I remember a lot of things, but I remember 2 in particular. First, it was hot in Mississippi in the summer, the kind of hot where the humidity level matched the temperature, and I'm not kidding. I remember one day it was 92 degrees and it was 90% humidity. That's a crazy combination. I could sweat just by simply standing still. Second, the football coach at the time at Jim Hill High School came to our house and said he wanted me to try out for the football team. He had seen my grades and thought I might be able to understand the nuances of the quarterback position. The team had already been practicing for 2 weeks when I went out in full pads for that first time. And that first time was also my last, as it was still hot. I mean, like crazy hot in August. I thought I might die right there on the practice field, and I hadn't even been to my first class yet in the school that ended up changing my life. Jim Hill School was founded in 1912 by James Hill for the establishment of a secondary institution for African Americans in the Jackson, Mississippi area. The desegregation laws passed in the 60s and 70s were slow to be enforced in Mississippi. It was painful. for everybody because old habits and perceptions die hard. But Jim Hill eventually had white students in its classroom, and I am so glad they did. By the time I got there in 1975, it was pretty clear that there was still a lot of work to be done. As I said, I thought I was good at relating with people of a different background than my own, but that notion was becoming less sure by the day. And it wasn't just people of a different skin color I was struggling to understand. Most white kids at Jim Hill were there because their parents couldn't afford to send them to the prep schools and academies so prolific during that era. I had always been a Christian, but soon learned that the quote unquote Christian education at private schools was mostly a cover for not having to put up with real integration. And I'm throwing no stones at people who chose to go to those schools back in that day. It just was a difficult time. We'll just leave it at that. When I tell people that I love going to school at Jim Hill, if they know anything about it, the response is typically one of surprise. Uh, the school is located near the heart of downtown, just a few blocks from Jackson State University. U.S. Highway 80 was just to the south of the campus, and the north side was bounded by several blocks of shotgun-style row housing and a cemetery. Jim Hill was a plain block and brick building typical of schools built in the late 60s. Mr. Emmett Hayes was our principal. He was a tall, dignified, and really wonderful person who was engaging with all of us as students. I remember that Mr. Hayes wore a suit and tie every day. Mr. C.L. Walker was the assistant principal, and he wore a white short sleeve shirt and dark tie every day. Mr. Walker was white. He tried to handle the disciplinary matters, but sadly, students from both races treated him with little respect at times. It was a real interesting juxtaposition during that sophomore year. It was very eventful. I was playing baseball for the same man who had invited me to try out for football, and I lasted the whole season this time because I was better at baseball than I was football. Somewhere in the summer months of 1976, between my sophomore and junior year, I thought I wanted to play high school basketball. I knew that the team at Jim Hill was loaded with premier talent. In fact, 3 players signed NCAA Division I scholarships, and one of them eventually ended up in the NBA. I didn't think I'd ever play basketball at Jim Hill, but a private school just a couple of miles south of where we lived offered some promise. I lasted 2 days. It was obvious that I would never feel at home in a place where many of my peers actually thought of themselves as superior based on the color of their skin. I heard things that made my skin crawl. Robert Frost was correct about those 2 roads. The road we take really does make all the difference. I decided I was going back to Jim Hill, and it made a world of difference for me. I called Jerry Gibson, the man who took the place of the previously mentioned baseball coach. He said he'd be glad to have me back. He was tough but fair, and I still love him. I still stay in touch with him. And there's probably a podcast in there somewhere with Coach Gibson. He won state championships in baseball in Mississippi, but he was also a champion of character. The road back to Jim Hill led me to pursue a love of writing. I was especially impressed with an English teacher, Mary Meredith, in my junior year, who, in addition to teaching English, Mrs. Meredith was faculty sponsor for The Echo, our school newspaper. She said she needed somebody to write articles about sports at Jim Hill, and I said, sign me up. And if you're watching, you can see members of our staff there. Mrs. Meredith is just over my shoulder there, and I'm looking at that picture with a lot of fondness for the people in the picture and that full head of hair. Oh, goodness. You know, working through times like this, I found that I had become very determined to help students at Jim Hill be prouder of their school. So I started writing a column called In the Spotlight. With Mrs. Meredith's encouragement, I wrote about the achievements of our athletes, but I was also trying to say to all students, we're better here at Hill than we think we are. Most of the students on staff were black, and so was Mrs. Meredith, but none of them, as I recall, ever brought that issue up. In fact, it was several weeks into my work with Mrs. Meredith that I learned her husband had made the news a few years earlier. It wasn't long before I found myself in the living room of James and Mary Meredith. It was a lovely evening of fun, food, and rich fellowship in the home of one of Mississippi's most famous champions of civil rights. I learned a lot from Mary Meredith. She was so full of life and love. She called me baby. She probably called other kids by the same name as well, but for me, it was a term of endearment that I still treasure. She taught me about relating to people of a different background more than anyone I've ever known, with the only exception being my friends Charles and Shirley Johnson of Meridian, Mississippi. Here's what I learned most deeply from Mrs. Meredith. Ultimately, we are all judged by who we are and what we do. Skin color may present obstacles for some, privilege for others, but in the final analysis, we're all responsible for the choices we make. If I had stuck with the ill-fated choice of switching schools in junior year, I know I would have missed out on some of the greatest experiences of my life. So each year on Martin Luther King Day, we see memes posted on social media, and people will post links of King's speeches. But when I hear Dr. King's soaring oratory from the Washington Monument, the dream of a day when people will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, I can say I knew the personification of that dream. And for me, her name was Mary Meredith. I had many wonderful teachers at Jim Hill. David Walker made math fun. Mary McCartney helped me learn how to give better speeches. I even took a turn on the stage under her direction in Arsenic and Old Lace. I was a pretty good third baseman, and I won a couple of certificates for journalism for my work on the paper. My classmates were kind to me when we voted for the all-school awards. I had a great time at Jim Hill. But what I remember most was learning how little I really knew prior to attending Jim Hill about relating to people who came from different places in life. It dawned on me that I had more in common with people of a different skin color than that of my own on many occasions. Mrs. Meredith helped me figure that out, and we never even talked about it. She just lived it out every day. My life was indelibly changed by that move to Mississippi in 1975. At the time, what I thought was the end of the world actually turned out to be the end of a worldview that was so limited in scope. As I sat with my grandfather at Mrs. Meredith's funeral in December of 1979, I wept. Sure, I was sad at her untimely passing, but I also wept tears of gratitude. Mary Meredith helped me learn, for real, how to relate to someone with a different background from my own, and we never even talked about it. Mary Meredith helped change my life. She gave me an opportunity, and I will forever be grateful for it. I mentioned Mary McCartney, and when I was looking back in my senior yearbook from Jim Hill, again, if you can see these photos, I had forgotten that Mary and Mary were right next to each other in that yearbook. Mrs. McCartney is now Mrs. Niederhode. I think I said her name right. She and her husband travel the world and in their retirement years, and she's a part of a church of ours down in the Clinton, Mississippi area. And still am able to stay in touch with her from time to time. But I am so grateful for the impact of teachers in my life that helped change my life. And I think one of the things that I have been thinking about the most and sharing this podcast with the world Who am I to tell you how to live? Who am I to tell you what decisions you need to make when it comes to relating to different types of people? I just have to speak for myself. I know what I have to do. And every opportunity that I have to encourage people to look at people not as representations of a certain demographic, but just as people. And if there's anything that any of us can do along the way, like Mary Meredith did for me and like Charles and Shirley Johnson did for me, to see people for who they are and not for what they look like or where they come from, we'll get to a better place. The world will be a kinder and more forgiving and more inviting and more inclusive kind of world. That's a big part of my story that has shaped who I have become all these years later. And I don't apologize for the emotion that is overtaking me in this moment. I am humbled to be involved in so many different ways with people that uh, I just think if we'll find a way to to continue to just be in the middle of doing something good for someone else, the world will take a turn for the better. There's a lot of hate and divisiveness in this world. Don't be part of that. Be a part of bringing people together. And I believe that God will bless our efforts as we attempt to do that. That's all I got for episode 26. And looking forward to seeing you again real soon here on Michael in the Middle.